Hey, Mike, do you fancy some raw food?
Oh, yeah. Steak tartare, sushi.
Oh, delicious. Or tell you what, let's get Mike Davies on, and he'll tell us whether we're allowed to have it or not.
Oh, okay.
Hi, I'm Mike Brampton.
And my name is Julian Ho.
Welcome to Veterinary Ramblings.
Mike, this is serious stuff because you've covered a lot in your career, and you're still obviously out there championing various things and done a lot of research and work and writing. But what I think our audience really need to know is what is your favourite bread?
What is my favourite bread?
Yeah.
At the moment, I like sourdough bread, actually, at the moment.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm rather partial to most types of bread. And the last loaf I bought, I actually went back to roots and I bought a toasty white sliced, because I haven't had one of them for about 25 years. And I just saw it and I thought, do you know, I fancy some toast with proper white bread. So that's where I am. But normally I'll be buying healthy stuff, allegedly healthy stuff, but sourdough is one of my favorites at the moment.
Jolly good.
I like sourdough, and sourdough has come up a few times on the show. Other than liking bread, however, Mike, you are a vet.
So what made you want to become a vet then, Mike? Why did you even start on this line?
Well, I was always biology orientated, and a lot of my family were involved in animals one way or another. So my mother bred German Shepherd dogs and showed them. And my uncle had he didn't have a farm. He worked on a farm, milking the cows for the farmer. And he had a little cottage. Every holiday I used to go down there and, help him out. And then all my mates were going to go and do medicine. And I just preferred the zoology side. In fact, originally I was going to do zoology.
Right.
But when I looked into that, there were no jobs in zoology, or at least there were teaching zoology, or maybe if you're lucky, get a research project, but there wasn't a lot. And I quickly switched. And I spent, as a kid, I spent a lot of time at Chester Zoo and other places, and basically just became totally engrossed with the whole idea of, I want to work with animals, make them healthy, the medical side. All my three mates, my best mates at Wirral Grammar School, they went on to be doctors. Well, one went to be a GP, another one went to be a surgeon, another one went to be a medic. And what happens is they clip their wings quite early in their career. They have to make a decision what to track themselves into quickly. Yeah. And if you go on and be like a surgeon, it's very hard. It's almost impossible to go back and become a cardiologist or something else. And that was the fantastic thing for me as a vet. That I was at one point going to be 100% orthopaedic, but then I saw the light. I ran a BSAVA meeting up in the Northwest region when a guy called Mark Morris Jr. came over from America. And I got a phone call from head office. We all did, actually, all the regional. I was secretary, I think, it might have been chairman, saying, this guy's over. He's got a few days spare. Does anybody want to hear him speak on clinical nutrition? And in the Northwest, we were always a pretty game bunch, So we said, we'll have him, next week or wherever it was. And, we got 60 people to turn out. And he blew us away with the science about the importance of nutrition in kidney disease and in heart disease. And none of us had heard any of it before. Not a word about, we hardly got a word about nutrition, never mind about clinical nutrition. And he blew us away. And that's how I got interested in nutrition in the beginning. I won't bore you with the rest of the story. It'll take the rest of this session. So I turned away from becoming a 100% surgeon because I love surgery. And gradually, as you now know, I still do general clinical work when I can, but I spend a lot of my time as a consultant just doing clinical nutrition. Yeah.
So you are an RCVS recognised specialist in nutrition and a fellow of the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons. So we should be saluting you.
No, not really. No, these days anybody can apply to be a fellow. Don't worry about it. But the reason I got a fellowship was at the time, after I'd left Hills, when I worked for Hills full-time when they launched into Europe and worked for them full-time, I went to the Royal Veterinary College and I would like to have done a qualification because my knowledge of clinical nutrition was so high at that point. Well, hopefully it still is. I wanted to do a qualification, but there was no diploma exam in Europe. I helped establish the European College of Comparative Nutrition, but actually it was nearly all farm animal when the people in Germany and places took over. And I wasn't interested in going back at my age and stage by then, because I'm talking about, well into my career. I wasn't interested in going back and doing poultry nutrition and pig nutrition again. So, and even the only exam other than, first of all, they weren't running an exam. And the only exam in the world was in America. And that was the same. It was very dominated by agricultural animals, which was no interest to me. So I approached the Royal College and said, I am qualified. I've done lots of stuff. What do you think? And they said, yeah, you're qualified to do a diploma, but we don't run one. So we'll set one for you, which is what they did. And what was quite funny was I'd left Hills by then, but they set an exam and they appointed as my examiners the head of Waltham. And somebody else was part of the Mars organization. So that was really weird, because I was now going to be examined by my peers who had been professional adversaries in the field until only a year earlier.
Did you pass?
It was quite an interesting experience, actually. It was quite an interesting experience.
I should just say, sorry, just to interrupt you. So some of our listeners aren't vets, believe it or not. And so just to explain to them that Hills and Waltham are adversaries. They're both big pet food manufacturers, but they are very, very much competitive or competing against each other for the share of the market. So being examined by your enemy. And you passed.
We're enemies, and obviously it's always very professional. There's a really professional relationship, but there were areas where, based on the science that I knew, and based on the science that, let's say, Jimmy Simpson, who was very much worked a lot with pedigree and was one of my other co-examiners, they were looking at things differently to how I'd looked at things based on the evidence that I had and that they had, and so on and so forth. So there was a competitive element, but it was always in good, absolutely, good taste. There was no animosity there whatsoever. It was good fun, actually. The biggest problem I had with the exam wasn't them. It was hard work. I have to tell you that, because it's like I think I'm just clicking this way. It was hard work because I had to do like 2-3 hour written papers and practicals and all sorts of stuff. But the hardest part of all was when I went to the Viva. Jimmy Simpson said to me, "Do you know that last question you answered? You didn't write very much, Mike." I said, "No, there's a reason for that, Jimmy, because after 6 hours of writing, I couldn't move my wrists. I was in absolute agony, because even then, I couldn't remember the last time I'd written anything. It's all on the keyboard now. You just try writing non-stop with a little break in between for 6 hours. It's pretty impossible. So that was really nice to put bullet points." Anyway, I got through that one. So that's why I've got the fellowship. One of my claims to fame is when I did 2 certificates when I was in practice, I did them just for my own personal education, not for any qualifications or letters. In fact, at that time, when I got my first 2 certificates, you weren't allowed to put letters after your name. The Royal College changed that later. The only thing you could do was change an M to an F on the Royal College thing. That was all. But then they changed it so you could put certificates and diplomas after your name, because people wanted to do that, because other professions do. And that's where we are now. And now there's some friends of mine who've got, in fact, they can't get it all on. They need a large size envelope to pay the postage to get all their qualifications on it.
Can I ask you what sort of state you think the profession's in at the moment?
Well, as far as I'm concerned, it's one of the best professions you can have, because there are so many things you can do in your day job, just in first opinion practice, but you can also diversify into any sector that you actually like, and it doesn't matter what your interest is, whether you're a desk person or you like the high-end stuff, imaging or surgery, or working in zoos, or I nearly went into the zoo actually, but there weren't any opportunities when I first qualified, so I didn't do that. And you can take it to the level you want. You can be, I wouldn't say just a first opinion clinician, because if you do it properly, it's fantastic, and there's lots of things you can learn and do. but you can become a really specialist down to microbe level if you want, or microbiome, whatever you want to do. So there's so many opportunities with a veterinary degree. So that's the first thing. The second thing, it's a great profession to work in, and working with animals is great because they can't answer your back really. They can bite you, but they can't answer your back. I find that more interesting. I'm talking to my medic friends. They have lots of issues with clients, patients, because they don't communicate, they lie. Like our owners lie to us, but their patients lie to them or don't tell them the whole truth. And that's much more difficult for them, whereas because they then have a problem if they want to say, well, they don't believe the patients. That's an issue. Whereas we can ignore our owner and just focus on the animal, and we can get all the information we need by properly examining the animal and asking the right questions. And then, okay, sometimes we have to take what they say with a pinch of salt. Personally, not happy about the way the profession is going, or has been going for a number of years now. People who are investing in groups are controlling what people in practice can do at grassroots level. So if you're a company with an interest, obviously they would want their products to be on the recommended list that people can use at a competitive price. But then they should not be able to interfere with clinical decision making, providing it's sensible decision making. And that was what was happening anyway. BVA saw my letter, said they really thought this was an interesting topic. And as I worked for one of the groups, I am talking from experience. They asked me to write a larger article, which I did, which has been published now. And I put in there some home truths about what the groups are doing and how it's not all positive. In fact, it's mostly not positive stuff in my experience. Over the 8 years I was at Nottingham University, working almost exclusively with final year students, one of the things I noticed was a dreadful change in a lot of their attitudes to the profession. When I qualified and you qualified, I'm sure, we wanted to get out into practice, earn our wings, get all the basics right and learn all the lessons we had to learn, and then move on and advance what we were doing to a much higher level. Now, a lot of these new graduates, they're not interested in that. They want to go out, they want to earn a high income for as short a period of work as they can get. So they want to work 3 or 4 days a week. In fact, most people in practice now only work 3 or 4 days a week, and they want to get as high a salary as they can. And some of them would rather go straight to locuming without any, and it is in practice at the moment that we're short on vets. A lot of the experienced vets are sold out and left the profession totally. And that's left a lot of practices being run by relatively junior clinicians, and even worse, relatively, in some cases, I have to say, poorly trained locums who've come from abroad before Brexit. Because I don't know if you know, but I was instrumental in trying to get a European qualification established many years ago. And we got all the deans of vet schools together and said, look, the standards, because the RCVS only recognised a handful of European veterinary degrees, so other people had to do an entrance exam. When we entered Brexit, that went, we had to allow anybody carrying what was called a veterinary degree into the country with no checks on them, no standard setting. Well, the last time I knew, in Italy, I think there were 13 veterinary schools, only 3 of which had achieved the European standards. Now, that might be wrong now, because that might be a few years out of date. But we were letting in these Italian graduates, and other countries, not just Italians, where they hadn't had a high enough standard of training to do the job, but we had to let them in. And so what I found when I was director of a region for one of the big groups, what I found was, unfortunately, because of what they were doing, which was kicking out the experienced clinicians to replace them with the juniors, they couldn't replace them easily because there's not enough vets around. And so they were running on locum power. And so the standard of locum can be from excellent, so don't get me wrong, some really excellent locums, right down to diabolical, some dreadful locums out there. And that is not good for general standards in practice. And we've lost too many experienced vets who are in the middle ages, not old, not geriatric like me, but, in the 40s and 50s who've sold out, taken the money, thank you very much, not doing very much. Now, the consequence of that, one of the main consequences then, is that there aren't enough people to see clients on a regular basis. So in other words, the traditional veterinary surgeon-client bond and relationship has gone.
Mm-hmm.
So now if you go to one of the big groups, particularly the groups, but some of the other practices as well, where they still can't get staff, you will not be guaranteed to see the same vet every time with the same case, which is what, in my practice, we always strove to do that. It would be very rare if I saw an animal with a problem, I didn't see it the next time. And I would book it in to see me, not make an appointment next week, see me, when am I next available for you to see me, so I could keep continuity of the case. And that's gone in a lot of the practices now, which I think, and I'll give you a true example. Before I left the University of Nottingham, I was running a clinic with one of the final year students, because how I did it was they did the consultation with me in the room, and then we'd talk about the case outside, and then they'd tell the client. So they did all the communicating with the clients, unless I had to step in and do something. Anyway, I looked at the cases before they came in, and one of them, I said to the student, how many clients do you think how many vets do you think this client has seen in the last 12 months with this dog for the same clinical condition? And she said, and I said, it's a lot. She said, oh, I don't know, 7 or 8, so we'll count them. And this is true, I was going to be the 21st different vet to see that client with that dog for the same condition in less than 12 months, which is absolutely atrocious. And that's what's going on all over the country.
That's dire.
I just think what we've lost relationship now. Yeah.
So
that's my worst concern is that.
Yeah, that's a dire situation. What's the solution?
Well, the solution is somehow practices, even if they're part of a group. So don't get me wrong, I sort of understand some of the motivation for having a large group, because of economies of scale. You can put in place, actually, if you do, they claim to do high level, work and putting in place procedures, what we call standing operating procedures, SOPs, which actually make everything run smoother and better, and for the health of the animals. Of course, when you actually dig deeper, it's not true. They think they're doing that, but it's not what's happening at the ground level. So what needs to happen is these practices, they need to bring back the fundamental basic requirements of a good veterinary relationship with an owner, which is that you see a vet, doesn't have to be you, but a vet sees that client with the case, and then they try to ensure continuity of care for that animal. Because if it is 21 people, I mean, even if we all said the same thing, we're all going to say it in a slightly different way. I know from the records that different people like to treat those conditions differently. So just imagine the confusion, that clients, every time they go in, they're being told something, even if it's similar, it's slightly different every time.
Well, one of the things I love about being a vet is that client-patient bond, the client-vet bond. I love it, and I'm fortunate enough to have been at my practice now for 16 years. I've been through several generations of a lot of people's pets, and they are the clients are almost family. We know each other very well.
That's not what you said. What
we're seeing in the profession, I absolutely agree with. Well, no, I don't like her. She's horrible. Okay. But what we're seeing in the profession is you're absolutely right. We're seeing younger, less experienced vets without mentors to guide them. And often, to compound problems, those less experienced vets are on part-time jobs. So they're working 2 or 3 days a week. Now, I'm going to have to bite my tongue here, because I'm working 2 or 3 days a week. So magic wand you could wave, what would you do?
Well, I think one of the things I hope that my correspondence through the veterinary record would do would be to shake up the Royal College, because the fundamental problem here is, I don't know if you remember, but when I was in practice, you weren't allowed to advertise. That was it. Veterinary practices could only be owned by veterinary surgeons, and we were bound by very strict codes of conduct about how we managed ourselves in public and spoke to media and all that stuff. And of course, in fact, I don't know if you know, but this year, the Royal College have relaxed the rules now, because I was helping a startup vegan company, which was founded by one of my students. It's called Omni. I was helping them from January through to recently. And the guy who is one of the vets who started it, he got in trouble with the Royal College. So people complained about what he was saying about his own brand on internet websites and things like that, and in pamphlets. Well, at the end of the day, if you invent something, it doesn't matter what profession you're in, you should be entitled to say, well, actually, this is me and I invented this, and
Yes.
talk about it. And he got his knuckles wrapped. In fact, they've relaxed the rules now, which I think is right, but it depends how far it goes. I mean, because Supervet advertises one specific pet insurance company. Now you see that wouldn't have been allowed in the past. If we were allowed to promote pet insurance companies, but the rule was, I don't know if you remember, we had to stock them all. We couldn't just have one in the waiting room. We had to have all of them available for our clients and recommend pet insurance, but
we normally hold the brochures out and sort of have one just an inch or so higher than the others and wink at the owner and say,
pick a brochure.
We're not allowed to promote one. Wink,
there you go. Pick a brochure. Any brochure you like. Pick a brochure. There you go. Have that
any brochure. Yeah. And they think they can run a practice like a retail outlet, but I'm afraid you cannot do that because without damaging standards. Because as soon as you take the experienced people out of the practice, the quality of work has to go down. End of story.
You're not afraid of causing a bit of a stir, though, are you, Mike? And I remember about 2 years back at BVNA, I chaired a discussion group or a debate, didn't I? You were on one side and various people were on the other side. Are we going to go down that avenue and chat about raw food?
Oh, absolutely. It should be, everybody should be talking about raw food and get away from the myth that it can be a debate, because there is no debate to be had. And the fact is, unfortunately, that vets in practice, and particularly people who are interested and believe for some reason in feeding raw, do not know the real risks. Most people, I lecture a lot in practices. I go in practices and I lecture. I've been on the lecture circuit for the last few months. Actually, I'm exhausted because I haven't stopped. I even did a 3-day, 28-module clinical nutrition course just 2 weeks ago. And then I was at BVNA Congress. So I've been speaking about this subject all the time. And people in practice do not know the facts because nobody is telling them the facts. And I was going to make this my CPD thing, so we can do it now if you like, but it'll take a bit more than a minute though. So
let's get on to your 60-second CPD. You're willing to take the challenge?
Okay. So Mike Davies, 60-second CPD. You're up for the challenge, yes?
Yes.
Excellent. So what's your 60-second CPD going to be on?
It's going to be on, we'll do an abbreviated version of the title I sent you. And we're just going to say it's going to be on lack of knowledge about clinical nutrition in veterinary practice.
Lack of knowledge, right. Okay. So here we go then. 60-second CPD. Dr. Mike Davies on lack of knowledge on clinical nutrition. Starting now.
When I go around veterinary practices all over the country and the world, I find that very few practices know what they're talking about when it comes to clinical nutrition. In particular, for example, everybody talks about things like cleft palate and skeletal deformities being genetic. Most of them are actually nutritionally related due to poor nutrition in pregnant animals. For example, did you know what a nutritional cause of cleft palate is? Most people do not know, and yet in the 60s we knew that it was due to excess vitamin A. It could also be due to deficient vitamin A. Almost every single skin disease that you see has almost certainly got a nutritional cause, not an allergy or some other factor, and you should be ruling out all those amino acids and essential nutrients like trace elements, which can be causing every single clinical sign you see in skin can be caused by a nutritional problem, which no veterinary practices actually look for because they don't know about it. And lack of knowledge is lack of ability to diagnose.
Wow.
And that's perfect. And that's spot on 60 seconds. Mike Davies, well done. That's fantastic. That's fantastic.
What I liked was the way that Mike let the clock run down 10 seconds before he started and still got it all in.
Because he knew that was how long the reflective question was going to take, presumably. So what is the question?
So my reflective question is, when was the last time you asked your owners what they actually feed to their pregnant animals during pregnancy? Because that can have a massive difference on the newborn, but also on animals in later life, which we now know. So when did you last do that? And if you have asked them, do you think you know how to interpret their response properly?
That's an excellent question. Two excellent questions.
That's two brilliant questions. So where do you find the answers then, Mike?
Me.
Well, I'll tell you what.
My 3-day course.
Of course.
I was going to say, I was lucky enough to have Mike as a lecturer at the LBC, so I know part of that. And having spoken to him over the years when we met up at conferences, I now know the sort of things to brush up on. If I see him walking towards me, I quickly Google what's up in nutrition, and then I can have a word with him. But you're absolutely right. I think that the majority of vets, I'd say every vet in practice, there may be a few exceptions, but every vet in practice knows far too little about nutrition to be able to answer those questions adequately.
Yeah, they do. And because of that, lots of diagnoses are misdiagnoses are made, or animals end up on long-term serious drugs to manage the signs, which work, but of course have secondary effects which are not desirable. And if it turns out it was not necessary to give the drugs, it's a totally unnecessary thing to be doing and potentially harmful. And there was a very interesting paper a few years ago where one of the vet schools in America, they had a cohort of dogs which had been diagnosed as having dietary allergies, right? And were on treatment for dietary allergies or other allergies. And when they went back and looked at the cases, they found that actually they weren't allergies at all. They were nutritional deficiencies, which showed the same clinical signs as a dietary allergy. And the thing about a nutritional deficiency is if you've got a problem, let's say you've got, I'll give you a really good example, right? Copper. Copper is a really important trace element. We know, David and I at Nottingham did studies in the UK, and we found that the vast majority of pet foods we analysed, which is about just under 200 in this country, do not comply with FEDIAF guidelines, right? And a lot of them are very low in copper, but also very high in other minerals that interfere with copper. We found that 1 in 5 wet pet foods in this country, which says complete on the label, did not meet the minimum requirements for copper. And that's before they've got high levels of zinc or calcium, which can also interfere with it, right? So there's a lot of animals out there which are copper deficient, and we know that because lots of black animals go brown, and the main reason for that is a lack of copper, right? If you've got lack of copper, you've got a lack of copper metalloenzymes. And copper metalloenzymes are involved in melanin production, which is why they go brown if you haven't got enough copper. And of course, melanin is really important in the skin. And I'm not going to go on and bore you with all the rest of the details, but there are lots of things that copper and other elements do in the body, which if they're deficient, lead to skin problems and skin disease and clinical signs. And there's a list a mile long of them all. Basically, what they found was that they changed the diets, and they'd assumed because the diet change had cured the animals, that it was because it was a dietary allergy to something in the other diet, right? But actually what they found was, no, what they'd done was they'd fed a food which actually met AFCO guidelines, it was in America, and all they'd done is replace a deficiency. So I don't know what the numbers are because nobody's looked. And when I've reviewed in the past skin cases, a lot of dermatologists in the past would talk about, giving essential fatty acids and seeing a massive improvement in skin and stuff like that, and in atopy and things. But they never actually looked at what the animals were being fed in the first place. They never bothered to analyse what they were on in the first place. So if you give any nutritional substance and an animal improves in some way, the most likely thing is you've corrected what was a deficiency before. Now, the food might not be deficient. The food might not be deficient. Yeah. It might have enough in, according to the guidelines, but the animal itself might have difficulty getting it into the body. So that's the sort of story we've got with the malamutes and zinc deficiency, where they get problems because even if the zinc's in the foods, they can't easily get it into the system to utilize. But, if you take that away, strip that away and just go back to basics, any animal with the classic skin signs of scale, pruritus, erythema, the list goes on, hair loss, alopecia, nutrition should be top of the diagnosis list. and ruled out before we start reaching for, particularly some of the more potent drugs, which are commonly being used in skin cases now. They're not necessary. Now, okay, if you can't find the cause, that's different. And people spend, to get a food analysed, to get the food analysed, because unfortunately you can't trust. Nowadays, we now know you can't trust what a label says about a product being complete. I would trust the veterinary companies because we know that they came out really well in our studies. Not 100% well, I have to tell you, but pretty well compared to all the rest. But I would, if you've got an animal, if it's on the same diet all the time, or if it's on a wacky homemade diet, which is even more common now, I would recommend you get the food analysed, and you'll be surprised what you will find. And, but you have to know a bit about nutrition, because you have to know not just about the absolute amount that you can analyse, but what else is in there that can interfere with it.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. So, it's very trendy at the moment to go for plant-based foods. Well, some of those plants, particularly things like, cabbages and broccoli and healthy things like that, and they have a lot of minerals tied up with phytic acid. Now that means you'll analyze the food. Okay, it's in there in plenty of amounts, but actually it's not bioavailable to the animal. So you can be fooled there. You can still get a deficiency of something if it's interfered with by fiber or by phytic, something like that. So it's not simple to get analyzed.
I'll give you an example as well, Mike, just to help with that, to substantiate that a little bit, and that's the idea of feeding raw eggs as an increase, a boost of protein, because that albumin, am I right in thinking it binds to other proteins, doesn't it, and limits their...
Avidin binds biotin, and my aunt actually got herself a puppy a few years ago, and I told her to put it on in those days I would have said any reputable company's complete puppy food. She did that, and I phoned to see how she's getting on. I said, and I'm putting 6 egg whites a day on it because the breeder says it's a good protein source. And that's the one time you do need to have good quantities of the essentials is in a growing puppy, because that's when you're most likely going to see a problem of deficiency. Fortunately, I managed to stop it. But biotin in that level, it would be bound by that level of egg white. So it's absolutely a no-no. Yeah. But there are more serious things going wrong in feeding animals at the moment, as you're probably aware, with raw feeding and things like that. That's really unbelievable.
Let's get on to raw feeding. So we touched on that. And I'd like to come back to the vegan feeding later, because that's another food choice that people want to make for their pets. Yeah. But raw feeding. So here we go. We've got a dog. It was a wolf 15,000 years ago. Wolves eat deer. So your dog should have I don't know, if wolves eat deer in the wild.
So how many years? So how many years do you think humans have been cooking their food for?
Quite a few years. So I'm going to go for. Actually, I wouldn't do that answer justice. I'd be guessing. I'd say.
No, come on, just have a wild guess.
You can't go
20,000 years.
You can't go beyond 6,000.
How long?
The planet wasn't around 6,000 years.
No, hold on. It's much longer than that, isn't it? Because Professor Alice Roberts, did a show about it. So it's a couple of 100,000 years, isn't it?
Yeah, it's at least proven 250,000 years. And we've been using fire in other ways for 400,000 years, and they think it may well have been used for cooking before that, but they haven't found the evidence for it. So it's 250,000 years man has been cooking food before we eat it. We know, first of all, the idea that wild wolves are obligate carnivores like cats is untrue. There's a paper been published in Greece where they examined the stomach contents of 32 wild wolves, and they found that plant material constitutes a significant part of their daily intake. So they're not strictly omnivores anymore. We know that the dog has undergone a number of genetic changes which now allow them to utilize plant material. So we know there's been 10 gene changes which allow them to be able to digest and utilize starches, which is the main form of carbohydrate in plant material. And there's a list a mile long of adaptations that the domesticated dog has undergone since it was originally a wild animal. So they have got taste buds for sweet. They have got digestive enzymes, amylase, alpha amylase in the saliva. At least a lot of them now do have, so that's the first stage of breakdown of carbohydrates as well. They've also got really high hepatic glucokinase levels, which is the enzyme that's essential for breaking down glucose. Now the cat lacks all of them. The domesticated cat does not have or hardly any amylase at all. It hardly has any taste buds and doesn't have any that deal with sugar, and they also totally lack glucokinase in the liver, which begs lots of questions, because a lot of cats are on carbohydrate-based diets, dry diets, and what the question then is, well, if they because we do know, despite the lack of amylase, they are able to digest and absorb starches, but what happens to that carbohydrate? If the glucose isn't being moved through the liver in a timely fashion, because the liver doesn't have any glucokinase there, that suggests that the glucose might be slushing around in the system longer, and that might be one of the reasons why we're seeing such high levels of diabetes, type 2 in the cat. Because when I qualified in the 70s, we would have recognized diabetes, because we recognized diabetes in the dog, like we would have recognized hypothyroidism if cats had it then, but they didn't have it then, at least not in any significant numbers. Now, there's another change, though, because obviously obesity is much more prevalent in cats now than it used to be when I qualified, and that's another contributory factor. So there's several contributory factors, but I think we can't actually totally rule out the possibility that high carbohydrate loading in cats is not a good idea. As far as dogs are concerned, though, there's no problem whatsoever. They can do. They are truly, genuinely omnivores, like we indeed are, and they can survive absolutely perfectly well, and have done for many years, just on plant-based foods.
You've strayed into cats, recognised as obligate carnivores, and we're talking about carbohydrate and the inability to utilise carbohydrate appropriately, and the corresponding inappropriate influence insulin reaction to that carbohydrate, and the development of diabetes, which of course is a major problem in human nutrition as well at the moment. The addiction to carbohydrate sugars. But where, in your opinion, where is this carbohydrate that's going into cats coming from?
Well, it's in the extruded dry foods. Because they've often got a carbohydrate cereal type base to them. That's where it is. It's in the dry foods, not so much in the.
That's to bind it, to make it
that's what binds it together to give it like a kibble. The kibble type foods.
Yeah. Why are we doing
from.
this? Why is that happening?
Because it's a utilizable source of food which the cat can use, and over the years, you've got to remember that feeding pets prepared foods only started after the First World War, because before that they were just fed whatever the household gave them, which was their own food, which would have been a mixture of veg. Dogs certainly would have had a mixture. Cats would maybe more have had meat, but it would have been always a mixture, and it would have been leftovers nearly always, except for very good families who had working dogs. Then they would have their own concoction, but they did always used to make a cereal, some sort of biscuit, and it was biscuits came out before complete foods did. The whole thing of complete foods is relatively new. That's a relatively new thing, and in fact, in some ways, that might not be perfect either. I haven't got time to go into that right now, but there are some issues about what the agencies say are what should go into a complete pet food. One of the issues is, and I've written to both AFCO and FEDIAF on this, and of course get blanked, is that I've tried for a company to formulate foods just using basic food ingredients, right? And it appears to me that it's impossible to make a complete food that meets all those requirements without adding at the end some sort of vitamin and mineral supplement mix at the end. And that's what all the pet food manufacturers do. To make sure they raise levels of things which are low, to comply, they have to add this, artificial mixture in, which is odd because cats and dogs have not evolved to require an artificial nutritional supplement to be added in, which begs the question that the guidelines that are set aren't right. I mean, to be fair, though, I think FEDIAF and AFCA will say they know it's not perfect. They absolutely know that. But as long as we meet the minimums, we should be right. But it appears to be impossible to make a food without adding a mix in. Now, I have read one website in America where one company claims that they do not add anything in other than, well, natural ingredients. But what does that mean, you know?
We're having to add ingredients to pet foods. Here's the simple answer. Let's feed them all a raw chicken a day.
Okay.
You know, it's natural. It's, you know, healthy, isn't it? You feed the whole chicken, well, they can get bones, they can get calcium from bones, they can get blood, there's a bit of iron in there, they can get feathers or a bit of fur if you can, the odd mouse in there. So, you know, what's the problem, Mike?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there's no problem in feeding the nutritional content of a carcass exclusively to a dog or a cat, providing you give them the right balance of the carcass. A lot of people who I know who are feeding raw are feeding basically homemade raw, and a lot of them, that means, you know, just a chicken breast or steak, or cats sometimes it's coaly fish or something like that. So very heavily, mainly just muscle meat, basically, is what they're getting, and that's totally imbalanced and will cause disease, and does cause disease commonly, but people don't recognise it.
But when you say causes disease, those diseases. Oh, sorry, Mike. Those diseases are diseases of imbalance of nutrients, aren't they?
Deficiency. If you look at if you were to feed a dog all its calories just as skeletal muscle, there are only two things on a long list that I could show you of ingredients where there's a minimum requirement. There are only two things apart from protein. So that would provide all the calories as meat. It would provide over 5 times as much protein as the animal actually needs, which is not a surprise because that's what you're giving it to get the calories in. But then the only two things that are above the line for minimum requirements are potassium and magnesium. And that's because they're intracellular. There's a long list of essential nutrients. Obviously, there's 0 calcium in meat, in muscle meat. And there's a relatively huge amount of phosphorus. So even if there were a trace of calcium, that would be wiped out by the phosphorus in an inverse calcium-phosphorus ratio, which we know will cause skeletal disease. But even then, there is inadequate amount of phosphorus in meat to meet the minimum requirements. So you're still deficient in calcium and phosphorus. And then across the board, vitamins and minerals, you're just deficient in everything. So meat is by itself, it's just a totally deficient thing. So what you have to do is give the animal access to everything in the carcass that it needs to get all those essential nutrients. And then the animal would have to be intelligent enough, or instinctively intelligent enough, to restrict eating areas of the carcass which would be toxic to it. So the best example of that is liver. We have to be careful here because some of the breeds of dogs we have might actually be okay. So the Alaskan breeds, for example, we know that they can tolerate huge amounts of fat intake, which if you live up there in the Arctic, in the cold and the conditions, and have to do work, you have to be able to get massive amounts of energy. The only way to get that into your body is in the form of fat. Now, if they couldn't tolerate high fat like we couldn't, then they would have trouble. So dogs can, or certainly certain breeds of dogs can tolerate massive levels, and probably relatively higher levels of liver as well. But the vast majority of us, absolutely not. So anyway, on this plate of food, on this Boxer Dog blog, it shows a plate, and I could tell you at a glance, because when I qualified in the 70s, we used to see hypervitaminosis A all the time in dogs and cats. Why? Because after the war, people were still eating liver. My dad used to cook us liver and onions at least 3 times a week. It was like a staple diet then because nobody could afford steak. So, in fact, you couldn't get steak until the 60s. So a lot of people said liver. So they were giving their dog and cats regular bits of liver, particularly raw liver. And, you know, you only need to give a little bit of raw liver 2 or 3 times a week, or even less than that sometimes, to cause hypervitaminosis A, because that's how potent, you know, it is.
And I think it's fused vertebrae, don't they? And awful disease.
So, it causes new bone around all joints, okay? And it's absolutely typical on an X-ray because you can see a space between the new bone that's formed and the periosteum, all right? And that's almost, it's almost pathognomonic for hypervitaminosis A, but it's not arthritis. Now, you can get an arthritic response under it, and the periosteum can be damaged because of the bony parts causing difficulty with range of movement and pain and things like that. And you can get secondary arthritis, but actually it doesn't cause arthritis. It's just new bone around joints and around the neck in particular in cats. So they have stiff necks or pain on moving neck or lameness in the legs and things like that. And it's classic. And there's lots of it around. That? You have to take them off the excess vitamin A. That's the first thing you can do. So the nutritional adequacy of these foods is very questionable, even with the commercially prepared ones. And I've not seen, I will tell you that in the study that we did at Nottingham, some of the worst ones, another one was the complete foods, which had more problems not complying with mineral and trace element amounts, were the raw foods were some of the worst. Okay, and the absolute best were the veterinary diets. That's what I'll say. There's been, as far as I can find, no evidence to show that any of these foods are actually complete and balanced as they should be. There was a paper published online which the Royal Veterinary Group said did show that they complied with AFCO and things like that. And in fact, vets were involved in the study and published it online, and it's available. If you want to go and find anyone's go look at it, just look up online raw proof and you'll find it. And if you read it, you'll find that actually far from proving that their foods, it was sponsored by one of the companies, far from proving their foods were complete and balanced, it proved they were incomplete and not balanced. But the vets who wrote the report tried to justify it, saying, well, their products were so much superior in quality that FEDIAF obviously had the standards wrong, which of course is absolute nonsense.
I'm going to break you off a little bit there, because I'm going to just tell you, I know as a lifelong BSAVA member and proponent, you know very well the BSAVA's stance, the British Veterinary Association stance on raw foods, which matches the American Association of Veterinary Surgeons and the World Small Animal Veterinary Association's stance.
No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. It doesn't. I'm sorry, it does not.
No. I was hoping if I fed you that line, you might. Yeah, there we go. There's a bit of a feed line, so carry on.
I know about this. You see, I do know about my topic, and it does. All of the American government agencies and all of the American veterinary associations unanimously totally condemn the feeding of raw meats to pets. End of story. Because they understand, because they've suffered a lot from the risks associated with it. In this country, the British Veterinary Association, the BSAVA, Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons, BVNA, none of them have taken the issue of risk to people in particular seriously enough, and they have basically downplayed it. And basically what the BSAVA says on their website is, if you want to feed raw to your dog, employ hygienic precautions and take the advice of your vet. That's what it says. All the other associations in the world absolutely condemn it. And the reason they condemn it is because what people are failing to recognize is that if you feed raw meat, well, to yourself or to your dog, you can be perfectly healthy. Your dog can be, or your cat can be perfectly healthy. Nearly always will be if they are healthy in the first place, but they are shedding that pathogen into the environment. And because dogs and cats lick the perianal region, they spread it across the coat and in the mouths. And Liverpool University have done some great studies looking at the oral concentration of very serious pathogens in the mouth of dogs fed raw meats. And basically, they're shedding, over a third of dogs fed raw are shedding serious pathogenic E. coli and salmonella sometimes from their bodies into the environment, which anybody who strokes them can get. Now, there was an outbreak of Campylobacter
and Listeria and Toxoplasma, Campylobacter, Clostridium.
Yeah. And keep going. TB.
Yersinia. Yersinia enterocritica, tuberculosis, tularemia, echinococcus multilocularis. Now, there's the real worry, isn't it, for this country, because we're free of that.
When I lecture on it, I only lecture on the zoonotic viruses. You haven't mentioned avian flu. There was a veterinary surgeon there was an outbreak of a serious avian flu in cats, which killed lots of cats in New York State a couple of years ago. One of the vets who handled one of the dead cats contracted avian flu, serious avian flu. He didn't die, thank goodness, but he got it. Now, in every other outbreak, as far as I know, they never found out where those cats got the avian flu from. In every other outbreak, in big cats, tigers, and in zoos, and in domesticated cats in the Far East and in Germany, the outbreaks have always been from consumption of infected birds, poultry particularly, but also wild birds. So they don't know where the outbreak came from. So let's come back to. But the most serious thing is this is not a hypothetical thing. A person in this country has died as a direct result of contact with dogs fed raw pet food in this country. And that was a very small cluster of E. coli, that was called sugar E. coli, which causes, unfortunately, can cause kidney failure. It's the most common cause of acute kidney failure in children in the UK. And in this outbreak, there were just four patients in this cluster. In that cluster, 3 of them were children, 1 was an adult, and 1 of them died as a direct result of contracting that infectious agent from dogs being fed raw. 3 of the dogs were being fed a prepared raw pet food, and the other dog was being fed raw tripe, which had exactly the same strain of E. coli in it. Okay. Mm-hmm. So it's undeniable. Now, only a year earlier, there'd been an outbreak of 30 people getting that particular infection in Dorset. I don't think anybody died, but I know that 2 children were hospitalized in intensive care. And in that outbreak, what they found was, in the very first case, they found the same infectious agent, which is the same type of E. coli, in animal feces in the garden, but they didn't work out what animal it came from. And then in 2 subsequent households that got infected, the house cat had the same infectious agent on board. Now, in that situation, in those days, they weren't asking questions about, has anybody here been in contact with a dog and was it fed raw or anything like that. They didn't ask questions about pets. They only asked about going on farms and petting farms because they knew they could get it from there. So in that case, they never found out. So they don't know whether the cats got infected first and gave it to the people, or whether the people got it first and gave it to the cats. And of course, they had no idea what the cats were being fed because they never asked the questions. 18 months later, they were asking questions about pets because that had been flagged up to them, and they found that actually it was pet food that was causing that cluster of 4. So it is serious, and there was an outbreak. I'm gonna
add. Sorry, Mike. I'm busting the games as I tend to do, and just add to the mix antimicrobial resistance, which is a huge problem in the medical field, human and veterinary.
Exactly.
And I'm going to ask you: is there an association between feeding raw diets and an increase in antimicrobial resistance? The answer, yes.
That's exactly what Liverpool have found. That these dogs being fed raw are shedding multiple drug-resistant E. coli. Over 30% of them. So I'm a vet, and I've always been very animal centric. Obviously, I no longer will stroke a dog or allow a strange dog to lick me unless I know they're not getting any raw at all. I as a vet now, do not stroke strange dogs. So that's where I'm going to go back to that, because you raised a very important thing about multiple drug resistance. Now, one of the organisms which is a big problem for humans and for us is Campylobacter, because that's multiple drug resistant. And there was an outbreak of Campylobacter across 17 states in America. Not that many people were involved. I think 130, or 100 odd people were involved, and only 30 of them were hospitalized, and nobody died. But what was important about that outbreak was every single person, so 98% of the people in that outbreak had contracted the infection by stroking a puppy in the week before. And all those puppies had been distributed, but mainly through one pet store distributor. So that study proves you do not have to come into contact with the food at all to contract these infectious agents. All you need to do is to stroke an animal that's been fed the food, that's given it the infection, and they're carrying it. And that's what people don't realize. And that's why when I talk to vets in practice who are pro-raw, and I was in a practice not that long ago, actually, in Sussex, and someone who's a long time and was feeding her own animal. And I pointed out this, and the salmonella, we know that salmonella numbers in raw pet foods has been going up in the UK. The latest figures show it's going up year on year because they're now looking for it and they're finding it. And the one we haven't talked about, pardon me, there are others, which I know that some of the trading standards companies in the UK have been trying to close down some of these raw pet food manufacturers because they are repeatedly putting into the environment foods which are carrying salmonella or one of the other serious infectious agents which they don't want. A Listeria monocytogenes, the main one.
Well, I think what I can take from all of this, Mike, is Julian, that's the last time I'm stroking your wife's puppies.
She doesn't feed raw, does she?
That sounds bad. That sounds bad.
Oh, did I get
right for that?
We'll move on. We'll move on from that. Julian, Mike, we've opened.
Are they raw puppies then?
We've opened, as I knew we would, a can of worms here, and thank you so much for venturing into there. You and I have spoken many, many times on raw food, and I would just say, just to sort of not play devil's advocate, because I'm part of the BSAVA, but the feeling very much within the BSAVA is we don't like raw food because of those dangers. What we want to do, though, is keep a dialogue open rather than turn clients away and make us from them and that attitude. So we want to try and educate people if we can.
I've got a question for you. I've got a question for you, though. Do you think it's right? Is it okay for a veterinary surgeon to recommend to a client that they do something to the dog or cat that A, might harm them and predictably could harm them, and B, if it doesn't harm them, could harm people and children?
And clearly the answer, absolutely clearly the answer is no. But I would advise listeners, particularly those listeners who may be considering a raw diet, to look at the websites and get the information. You've got to hear from Mike. Mike has given a very good exemplified picture, an evidence-based picture of this. Mike, we could go on for hours about this, and I know we would, sure, and we probably will. But I feel we must end somewhere, and so what I'm going to do is give you your certificate, CPD.
Oh, thank you very much, sir.
And so here we go. It says Certificate of Good Meaty Nourishment.
Check on the back of it.
The check's on the back, yeah. So
we covered that at the very start, Mike. Sorry. Yeah.
It says this certifies that we should be respectful of others' beliefs unless they are, frankly, wrong. And if in doubt, evidence it. And so what I've done is I've shown, look, I was hoping to get in, these are crab claws, and I was hoping to get into the 3 people who died in China recently through eating raw crabs.
Right.
Raw oysters, well, we eat raw live oysters, they're fine. Yeah. But here's a little dog that was very unwell through salmonella a couple of years back, probably eating a raw diet. Now, here's lovely French cheese. Now, listeriosis, we all know the danger of that in pregnant people. Here's some lovely sushi.
Yeah.
But to get back to, and here's a nice rare steak at the bottom here. But in the middle here, anyone recognise what that is? Do you recognise what that is?
That looks like a sourdough loaf.
It does. It's a type of fungus.
Okay. Yeah.
Yep. So it is called Fistulina hepatica, or beefsteak fungus, and there is evidence to suggest that they have been harvested for at least a couple of 100,000 years. Now they must be cooked, and they must be cooked, or they're best cooked in a bit of milk, but they must be at least boiled, because otherwise they are inedible. And so we know that this knowledge of cooking has been going on for many, many centuries. Why spoil it all and say, well, let's not bother cooking things anymore? However,
well, if the motivation for wanting to feed raw is because you don't like commercial production process, that's fine. Get hopefully a balanced set of raw materials and just cook it before you give it the dog. There was an outbreak of botulism where there was a carcass that was in a freezer, and actually what happened was they had a flood and they lost the electric, and they never opened the freezer. Later, it froze again, obviously, when the electric came back on. Then the carcass cut in two. One owner took half the carcass away and fed it raw to her dogs, and she had dogs dying from botulism. The other owner took half the carcass away and cooked it and fed it to her dogs, and none of her dogs got ill. There's a moral in that somewhere.
There is really, isn't there?
And
Mike,
on that note,
it's always a pleasure talking to you. It really is. And we can go on and on.
Paul, it's been an absolute pleasure to meet you, Mike.
Thanks.
So all it beholds for me to do is to say thank you very much indeed, Mike Davies. Absolutely illuminating and educational and entertaining evening. And if any of our listeners have enjoyed what they've heard tonight, don't forget to click like, subscribe. It really does make a difference. And tune in to the next episode of Veterinary Ramblings. With no further ado, may your dog go with you, Mike.
And yours. Cheers.
May your dog go with you.
Cheers. Thank you very much indeed.